Resuming debate, reprise de débat, the honourable member for Sturgeon River-Parkland.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It has become more and more apparent that this is a Liberal government that has run out of steam and run out of ideas. We are now nearly 3 months away from what was supposed to be, in the Prime Minister's word, quote, the most consequential election since 1945, and yet Canadians still have little clue about what direction this Liberal government is taking our country. Canadians can be forgiven, I think, for a profound sense of déjà vu as they read the latest throne speech delivered by the Governor-General. In many ways, it reads exactly like the throne speech from 2020, so much so that Canadians are wondering just why we needed to have an unnecessary, reckless, expensive $600 million pandemic election. To be sure, there are some important points in the throne speech, such as fighting the pandemic, getting Canada back to normal. There are promises to address reconciliation with First Nations, to take action on climate change, to strengthen the middle class, and to grow the economy. Now, these are all important promises, but when we look at the record of this Liberal government, particularly over the last 3 years, we see a lot of talk but little action. As Conservatives, we believe that the purpose of winning elections is so that we can legislate to fix problems and seize opportunities for our country. For the Liberals, it's the other way around. They legislate and make promises so that they can win elections and seize opportunities for themselves. This abdication of leadership has led to a country that is dealing with more than one crisis, where the government can say the right thing, but action is rarely forthcoming. One columnist recently wrote that this Prime Minister is the return of the infamous Mr. Dithers character, someone who has, quote, hit the ground running at a sloth in slow motion speed. This is no longer the government of idealists elected in 2015. It is a government that desperately wants to hold on to power, divide and conquer Canadians, and take the bare minimum of action needed to remain in government. This has resulted in a terrible situation in our country, where very real problems are not being addressed with the seriousness that they deserve. In the throne speech, I was disappointed to see little or no mention to significant issues that Canadians care about right now. For example, in Canada, we are undergoing the most significant period of inflation since I've been alive. For decades, Canadians could rely upon fiscal and monetary policy that maintained an inflation rate close to 2%. This meant that Canada's economy could grow at a solid rate, while ensuring that prices for goods did not drastically increase. Now we are seeing very significant increases across all sectors, with food, fuel, housing, and vehicles all seeing steep jumps in prices. One recent report also indicated that almost every investment asset class, when calculating for inflation, is returning a net negative real return. The consequences of letting inflation run at these levels will impact families for generations to come. It will mean less money saving for retirement. It will mean more resources dedicated to just the essentials and less for achieving Canadians' dreams. It will mean eroded standards of living for retirees on fixed incomes, who will look at the value of their nest eggs shrink as the money supply expands exponentially. The government promises that it will find a way to make Canadians whole, but we saw the consequences in the past of government trying to control wage and price inflation. It only exacerbated the problems further. The most significant actions that have worked historically to address runaway inflation have been for the government to get its fiscal house in order and for the Bank of Canada to raise interest rates. These are bitter pills to swallow for Canadians who have grown used to massive government largesse and artificially lowered interest rates. The Liberals, I fear, will try and win politically by forestalling the inevitability, by increasing spending, and by allowing the Bank of Canada to let inflation run even higher, thus forestalling the need for increased interest rates. The consequences of this will mean exponentially more pain for Canadians in the future, as the government loses its ability to finance deficit spending and the Bank of Canada loses its ability to control inflation. Canadians deserve a government that will make the tough choices that will ensure that future generations can have a better life than the one we have. And I know that hitting the doors in my community, the cost of living was top of mind for many families. Canadians need to see leadership from this government, and they aren't seeing it right now from these Liberals. There is also nothing in the throne speech to comfort the anxiety of my constituents in Alberta. In my region, we rely on agriculture, forestry, oil and gas, and the service sectors to put food on the table. On the agriculture front, there is only one mention in the speech from the throne, and that's about creating a Canada Water Agency. But what about a plan to ensure that Canadian farmers can continue to access world markets? What about a plan to address the rising cost of agricultural inputs like fertilizer and fuel, which are threatening global food security? Serious issues, but no mention by this government. Where is the plan to fight the Americans on the unjust doubling of softwood lumber tariffs? Where is the plan to ensure that our oil and gas sector can continue to sustain our economy for generations to come while reducing and eliminating greenhouse gas emissions? I see company after company from Alberta pledging billions of dollars in combined resources to implement revolutionary and effective carbon capture technology. Where is their willing partner in the federal government? Where is the tax credit for enhanced oil recovery, which will sustain new low-carbon jobs and investments for decades to come? It's not to be found in the throne speech, Madam Speaker. Instead, we just get ideological talking points and promises to shut down our jobs and our industries. The word just transition has become a nightmare for Albertans. I have many people in my riding who lost their jobs when coal power plants were phased out a few years ago. Communities and my workers were promised by this Liberal government that they would have compensation and a just transition. The last promise in the 2019 budget said $100 million for coal communities. Well, we haven't seen any funding from this Liberal government, and it's been 2 years. Folks in my area know exactly what a just transition means. It means less jobs, less prosperity, and more just inflation. It's time for the Liberal government to take cooperative action with the oil and gas sector to ensure the prosperity of all Canadians, not just those that are represented by Liberal MPs. The speech from the throne also failed to address the elephant in the room right now in Canada. One of our most important institutions has been on the news on an almost daily basis, and not a lot of it has been good news. And I'm talking, of course, about the Canadian military and the numerous scandals that we have seen. Now, as someone who represents a large military community in CFB Edmonton, I know my constituents are extremely proud of our Canadian Forces members. But every day they lose confidence when they see this Liberal government fail to act and fix problems. An institution as important as the Canadian military deserves far more attention from this government than it received in the throne speech, where it was not even mentioned once. Sadly, this is just another case of the Liberal government failing to tackle the important issues that Canadians want to see solved. In closing, Madam Speaker, yet again, the Liberals' rhetoric has failed to match the reality of action. When the Prime Minister said this was the most important election since 1945, he clearly wasn't talking about its importance to Canadians. Instead, he was talking about its importance to his own ambitions for a majority government. We see bills being passed today which would have been and could have been passed if we had not had an election. Bills like C2, C4, and C6. We see legislation which last night was passed with unanimous support, like C3, which fulfilled a promise from all the way back in May 2020 to implement paid sick leave. Legislation which the Prime Minister at the time said would be implemented without delay, and took a year and a half to produce a mere page of legislation. In fact, it wasn't even important enough to merit its own legislation. It had to be merged together with a criminal code amendment. We see a recycled throne speech, and I praise the government for their commitment to recycling, which largely repeats the promises and agenda of the government from last year in 2020. Madam Speaker, it is clear, as I said at the beginning of my speech, that this Liberal government has run out of steam, it's run out of ideas, and Canadians are growing more disappointed each and every day as they see the priorities that they talk about around the kitchen tables with their families every night not being reflected in the policies and action of this government. And I hope, for the sake of all Canadians, that this government can get its act together. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The honourable member for, or the Deputy House Leader.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I listened intently to my colleague across the way in his speech, and One of the things that jumped out at me is when he mentioned we're here to legislate to fix problems, and I agree. And I think we've demonstrated that over the last 6 years, whether it be medical assistance in dying, whether it be conversion therapy, and finally banning conversion therapy. I'd like to know if the member opposite will be supporting us with respect to C2 to make sure that we are fixing the problem of the gaps currently experienced because of COVID-19.
The honourable member for Sturgeon River-Parkland.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. And we as an opposition have a sacred duty to hold this government accountable. And we have seen so many times during the past 2 years, during this pandemic, when the government has pushed forward with legislation that we found had serious flaws. And so we're not going to abdicate our responsibility, our duty to Canadians to hold this government account to ensure the best possible legislation. And I would say to the member, if they were so concerned about getting this legislation passed in a timely way, then why did they waste Canadians' time and taxpayers' money on a reckless, unnecessary $600 million election, which didn't change a single thing in this House? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Cowichan-Malahat-Langford.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for Sturgeon River-Parkland for his intervention today. In previous speeches from the throne, I remember seeing the Liberals talk a lot about putting in national pharmacare and making a reference to dental care. In this throne speech, they are nowhere to be found. Boof. It's like they never even existed. And he's right. In my riding, the cost of living is a huge subject of concern amongst my constituents. Unexpected medical costs, the cost of pharmaceuticals, the cost of dental care, these are huge issues for working families in Cowichan-Malahat-Langford. What does the member think about the fact that the Liberals used to wax so eloquently about these programs and they are nowhere to be found in this 2021 version?
The honourable member for Sturgeon River-Parkland.
I want to thank the member for his question and for his commitment to his constituents. You know, there's an old adage that says, fool me once, shame on you, or shame on you. And fool me twice, shame on me. Well, this NDP party has been fooled not once, but twice by this Liberal government. First, when they promised paid sick leave in May 2020 in order to get NDP support for a hybrid parliament. And then secondly, with pharmaceutical and dental care. And the member has seen, yet again, that the Liberals have tricked the NDP. So when are the NDP going to wake up and stop getting tricked by these Liberals and stand up to them for a change?